Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today, we're joined by Assistant Professor at the University of Calgary, Dr. Matt Jordan. Dr. Jordan bridges the gap between science and practice. He's a sought-after presenter on sports injury prevention, training program design for elite athletes, and creating interdisciplinary high-performance practitioner teams. Matt holds a PhD in medical science and a master's in exercise physiology with a specialization in neuromuscular physiology. Matt's PhD research focused on return to sport neuromuscular monitoring for athletes with ACL injury. Matt has authored and co-authored several peer-reviewed articles and regularly presents at scientific clinics. Over his career, Matt was the personal strength coach to 30 world and Olympic medalists and has worked with elite athletes in many sports, including speed skating, cross-country skiing, alpine skiing, snowboarding, biathlon, hockey, football, volleyball, and mixed martial arts. Matt's also consulted with professional sports teams, including the NHL, NFL, NBA, and Major League Baseball. It's quite an interesting and insightful conversation that we have with Matt. In it, we speak about thinking like a scientist, the difference between inductive, deductive logic, the mentorship that he procured through Dr. Walter Herzog at the University of Calgary, return to play from lower body injury, what tests to use, what metrics to look for, and his research in return to play from ACL injuries. It's a massively insightful 90 minutes of dialogue. Make sure we come back for part 2 because it was fantastic. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Matt. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Glad we could finally make it happen. Really appreciate you reaching out and getting me on.
It's going to be a fantastic hour. Someone that I've looked up to quite a bit in terms and measures of the information you put out, the research that you've been conducting, and the application specifically to strength and conditioning and performance. So really excited to start our conversation. I want to start really with thinking like a scientist and then back to your graduate school days, specifically the influence that you had with one of the best in terms and measures of osteoarthritis, neurobiomechanics, biomechanics, University of Calgary, Dr. Walter Herzog. What influences has he made on your career? And specifically, not just as a person, but as a scientist, were there any things that popped out to you, Matt, during your time in tutelage under Dr. Herzog?
Oh yeah, I mean, tons of things, and it's great to always reminisce about what he brought to my career and to the career of many other people as well, and also the impact he's had on science and in our area, because it was truly profound for me personally. Walter's always been instrumental in helping me try to figure out how do I connect my applied thinking brain that often surfaces, for coaches and people in our world to a scientific way of thinking, and being able to connect those two spheres. And that's not an easy thing to do. And I think that what I struggled with, and this is going back, when I was involved in my master's and I was floundering, trying to figure out, my research was all on whole body vibration, and I was kind of lost. I was figuring out what I was going to do and how I was going to do it and what would be relevant. And he was just super instrumental in helping me figure out questions that mattered, helping me to think critically about data that I was collecting, helping me to think critically about how to interpret it and, where the limitations of my knowledge was.
Sure.
I can always recall him saying to myself and so many others, graduate studies is more of a test of your character than a test of what you know.
Yeah.
In the idea of being able to say, I don't know the answer to that. I have no idea. And really, I can think of these moments, Anthony, where I've been, I remember distinctly one lab meeting where I was sitting there and I would just sort of soak it up and listen to what the group was doing, because it was research and study completely different than my world, very, very much basic science. And, I can remember them finding things or seeing something in the data and publishing something. And, where some people might be sort of high-fiving and saying that we've just discovered something, Walter's immediate reaction would be, it's amazing. Now we have to put it out there and see if other people can reproduce it. Very much in this mindset of how do we advance this knowledge and carefully to say, we've seen this and we've shown this, but whether it's true or not, we don't know. And, that would be kind of my final point is he always had this idea that, what I know to be true today will probably be proven false in 60 years. And on that note, I think where he's helped me is to really think critically, to understand the limitations of the world that I live in and that I try to play in this world of sports science. And I guess importantly, to try and, approach it with some humility, maybe, hopefully, and just some understanding of how hard it is to do what we're doing. And I really owe him a lot.
Very interesting. As a matter of fact, it's one of those deals too in science that we're dealing with right now, which is the reproducibility issue, having to try to reproduce these studies. The other thing in science that it really struck me with what you said is, great scientists and great people try to put their ego to the side and they're looking for that to be falsified because it gets closer and closer to the truth, such as the scientific. We don't prove in science. We offer better explanations, better conjectures with evidence and explanation. And the hope is to put it out there and try to continue to grow where there's critique that work and get one step closer. Would that be accurate, Matt?
I mean, I think that is accurate. And I think that, the thing Walter often says is, look at the type of work that I'd be doing and you say, he was originally a track and field coach. A lot of people don't know that about Walter. His journey was track and field coach in Switzerland. I think he's almost like a high school teacher, but very, very like a real big track and field buff. He's competed at the masters level. He was a 400, 800. No, he's an 800, 1500 meter runner, I think. But I wanted to do more because I wanted to become a better coach. And that's what got me into his, the graduate studies and his PhD work. And then he hits this place in his career where he realizes how hard it is to study humans. And that's when he made a pivot to say, it's too hard. There's so much variability, and he pivoted his career. We're probably going back to the early 90s, but that's when he pivoted his career to animals and studying mechanisms and doing scientific research, much more basic, but almost out of the human realm altogether, because he always said it's just too tough. So I think that in our world, Anthony, that's exactly what we're trying to do. I just think that when we get to sports science or the science of high performance training and injury, it does get hard. It's hard to do good science in that space for a number of reasons. And I think that you need to sort of figure out which tree you're putting your ladder against in terms of the questions you're trying to figure out and answer. And you've got to be able to create study methods that fit with what happens in high performance sport. And I think that's where a lot of researchers go awry with this, and kind of goes back to your question about what's the point? It really depends on where you are, right? I mean, I think in high performance sport, where I think a lot of practitioners scientists go wrong is they'll say, well, we want sport to plug into our scientific experiments or to the research we do. And anybody who works in sport will know that that's a major buzzkill for an athlete. If they've got to plug into a randomized controlled trial, or they're spending all this time doing stuff that never comes back to help them, it's got to be a different lens. And so I think that it is ultimately the goal, but it is so contextual.
Can I pick it ask another question that you just tapped on? You said the methods and the difference between, possibly lab and sport. Would it even go as far in terms and measures of the methods in terms of even just randomness, right? Random testing as opposed to how it would typically work in a team setting where you're getting everyone, vertical jumping and then the next person vertical jumps. Whereas, are we getting that granular when it comes to the methods that are different in terms and measures of the contrast between sports science and then, publishing a paper? Does that question make sense, Matt? Or am I?
Oh yeah. Oh no. You're making a ton of sense. And I think that a couple of things stand out to me. And first of all, I think on some level it's how does reasoning happen in applied settings like the world we live in? And
Yes.
how does reasoning happen in more traditional scientific thinking? And in more traditional scientific thinking, you have sort of a line, and that line represents, I guess, existing theories, what's currently known or believed to be true, and at its core, I think science in that world, science is about making predictions, right? So
Yes.
you see this in numerous more physical sciences, yeah, and more sort of the world of physics, astronomy, that you have an existing theory, and the theory sort of allows you to make predictions. And then when predictions are not holding, and there are holes, in the theory.
Yep.
It's sort of like you see the boundary of understanding, and scientists are working, feverishly at that boundary to try to push it one step forward. But they're going from theory to sort of hypothesis to sort of driving an experimental concept or idea. And then they're going to observation to test the idea.
Got it.
And what I think is the difference in sports science is we do that sometimes. Don't get me wrong. I think that is part of the process. But I think what coaches are intuitively doing more often is not that deductive reasoning, but more of inductive reasoning. So what you're doing is you're observing around you.
Yep.
You may be taking measurements. You may be collecting various types of data and inputs. Let's face it, some of these things are, by the fact that a lot of the things that we do are hard to measure, I believe that some of these things are just sort of locked away in the mind of the coach. But that's sort of what's happening. You're collecting these points, and then you're going from observations to then the idea about what might be explaining things.
Yes.
To arrive to move it forward. So it's like you say, well, I'm seeing these data points. So observation first. My theory is that this athlete is, I don't know, ready to rock and roll at the next games, and they're peaking perfectly for the competition. So then that's my theory on this. So I'm going to move one step forward. I'm going to say that my training hunch, my training idea is going to be that we're going to stay the course here and continue, because what I'm seeing at the observational level is that, and away you go, right? So I think that's one piece that I think is really, really different. And just quickly, the second piece is that most, you sit in a conference, right? And you'll see somebody present their data. And I wrote a paper with Sophia Nymphius where it's called Show Me the Data, Jerry. Like right after, Jerry Maguire, like, show me the money, Jerry. That was the tagline there in the movie. And, show me the data. And we were talking about the importance of showing the raw data, so don't just show the bar plot that's the mean of the group with a deviation. Like, show us what happened. And what I would say is just pay attention when you're at these moments. And what most people who are really curious and really looking at the slides and really looking at the data will do is they'll hone in on outliers. So they'll say, wow, I'm just like looking at the responses in your group, and I noticed there's like 2 or 3 people that are responding really differently than the others. Can you shed some light on what might be the characteristics of those people? Because they're so different than the rest. And therein lies the hierarchy of evidence for our world, right? It's like we care about the N=1 game. And that's kind of the highest level. I mean, on average, a training method may or may not work, but crap, Anthony, if it works for you, that's all I care about. I want to know what works for you, and I want to be able to unravel your training response and how you adapt. And so that's kind of the second thing is, I think a lot of times we want to know the big rocks for the individual.
So if I could kind of wrap this up in a bow, in terms and measures of the big differences between coaching and lab research, we in this inductive approach goes from observation to hypothesis, as opposed to the research approach where it's much more of a deductive, which is hypothesis to observation, right? That's where we're living in the kind of the two worlds. Does that make sense?
I think that's pretty fair.
And then the data, I think this is so interesting because I listened to another podcast on Econ Talk. It has nothing to do with strength and conditioning, but it has everything to do with strength and conditioning. And specifically, I like to listen to the economists that have a background in data science. And one of the analogies that they said is you're going to feel much safer when you prepare the food, as opposed when someone else prepares the food. You never know what happens in the back, right? With the data or how it could be manipulated. I know we're off on a totally different tangent, but then you can do everything from, what is thrown out? What are the you can make that result a little bit more tasteful to the main dish.
Yeah.
I thought it was very important, very interesting. Let me ask you this question regarding critical thinking. Was that something that you feel that you learned as a graduate student? Do you think it's something that can be taught, or is it something, hey, Anthony, I mean, we're all critical thinkers. I had critical thinking skills when I was in high school and undergrad.
I think that is something that is uniquely developed. It's uniquely developed through a process that almost always occurs in grad school.
Yes.
So, but it doesn't have to be exclusive to grad school. I think you could be, you could certainly, in my opinion, develop these skills elsewhere. But if you were in a good graduate program with a good supervisory committee who understands what the name of the game is, I think it is a true development of character process. And, specifically, I think that's where, when you're in a really good defense for a master's or a PhD and you sort of see that the committee's challenging the student on their ideas and they're pushing the student in terms of their knowledge base. And I think that it's fair to say that they're pushing the student to see when the student says, I just don't know the answer to that.
Yes.
It's almost as though it's like the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm sure you've
Yeah.
Anyone who hasn't heard it, just go Wikipedia, right? But it's this idea that, when you're early on in your development of knowledge, you read voraciously and you soak in knowledge sources, whether it's TED Talks or YouTube videos or podcasts or news articles or website, but whatever it might be. And you very quickly amass bits of knowledge without context. Very often, too, I believe it's sort of like we're in the tic-tac era age of knowledge where it takes nothing to digest this stuff. I mean, my wife, my wife just finished, doing a 75 hard, which is like you exercise every day, twice a day for 75 days. And she devoured 8 books, podcast or audiobook form in like 75 days, right? It's just so accessible now, but we would all know that if you're in graduate studies, it's great. You've read it, and shout out to Mladen Jovanovic, but like he would say,
the Serbian sensation. That's what I call him.
We get up and be like, we all got a case of abstractitis.
Yeah.
And this idea that you read the bullets, you read the highlights, but you don't digest the information. You don't really dig into the information. You don't really dig into the methods, the results, contextualizing how one study fits amongst all the other studies, understanding the limitations. And to me, that's what grad studies is, Anthony, is it's like you have a chance to really develop the true skills of how to take information in, how to design studies, do research, and then to be truthful, just to be able to have a moment of reflection about the fact that you don't know everything.
As our island,
you're like, I admit it. I've seen the light. I don't know everything, and I'm okay with that.
As our island of knowledge grows, so does the shoreline of our ignorance. I feel dumber and dumber every day when I speak to smarter and smarter people, and you learn the limits of your knowledge for sure. I think it's interesting too. I wanted to hit on this because I'd be curious because you're a pro. I'm a new PhD. You've been doing this for a long time. One of the things for me right now, so if I were to get a paper, the first thing I'm hitting is methods. That's the first thing. And then I want to look at results. That's the first thing. And then I want to look, my goal is, at least in the applied setting, I want to see what the methods were. And I want to try to pick them apart, not in a bad way. I want to find fault with them to see if the results can garner what they're saying. And then I want to read the results. Is that where you go to? Like, you're a seasoned vet. You got a bunch of research on your table. Where do your eyes move first? What's important to you right off the get-go?
Yeah, I mean, beyond scanning a title, looking at the author group, scanning the abstract, and making a determination that this paper is interesting to me, and I'm going to put it in my folder, into my Mendeley, and I'm going to keep it in there. Obviously, that's just sort of more the constant scanning of what's going on in the world and seeing what's happening. Now to sit down and digest the paper, I do very, very similar. I like to go initially to the methods and understand what the design was, what they looked at, what they were trying to sort of like, how they tried to structure things. And then I typically try to go to the figures and take a peek at what did they measure? What are they trying to do with their data, and to understand a little bit about what's happening. And I think what that lets you do is, again, a thing I learned, this is another Walter thing that really always jumps out at me. He talks about it himself on his journey, because there's this sort of well-accepted notion that when you think about sort of how the muscle force length relationship, and you may remember there's a plateau region where basically force is proportional to the overlap of actin and myosin. And I mean, theoretically, that's probably a better way to say it, that you can't exceed that plateau region in terms of the force generated by a myofibril. And so, it was long held that was a tenet of the cross-bridge theory. And in these stretch experiments of actively contracting muscle, you take it and stretch it, forcibly stretch it. They would observe that, it's called force enhancement, but you take a muscle that's active, you forcibly stretch it, and then you go back to, sort of look at the new length it gets to compared to the force that was generated before the active stretch at the same length. So you got, and there's more force after the active stretch. But it was sort of accepted that this wouldn't exceed the plateau region. And then there was, I believe, a student of Walter's who was reading this paper very, very carefully and was sort of looking at the magnitude of these stretches and, looking at the plateau region and just said, it sure seems to me like that force is exceeding the plateau region. And it seems to be that the more they're stretching, the more this is exceeding that region. And what the authors had concluded in that paper, because I believe they were deeply entrenched in the theory, the cross-bridge theory itself, is that increase in force above the plateau region was just experimental error. It's not real. And so Walter, for a good 15 or 20 years of his career, maybe that's a little bit of a long period, but for a majority of this time, sort of just accepted it too. And I was like, well, you just can't do this, until he's like, holy crap, you're right. It does. Let's look at an experiment now where we actually do apply much larger magnitudes of stretch. Let's look at force. And now they really increase the stretch of the active myofibril. And lo and behold, they really stumble on this mechanism of, force enhancement. And that leads to a whole other world of, okay, so if that's the case, the cross-bridge theory is no longer making accurate predictions, because, it's the prediction is that force is proportional to overlap, but clearly it's not. So there must be something else going on in muscle. And that's Walter's, that's been Walter's research paradigm, is studying the muscle protein titin and how it might sort of contribute to passive force enhancement in a myofibril that's been stretched. But my point here, Anthony, is like even the best scientists in the world can get sort of locked into I hate to say it's not groupthink, but like you get locked into accepting things to be true until you really look at the data and really try to understand what's happening. And that might mean you have to read the same paper 15 times and have 5 different eyes on it before you really discover what might be truly hidden in the data. And so it's a long way to say, like, I think that scrutinizing the data and looking at the figures and really trying to remain critical in our thinking is just the best recipe for anybody whether you're a graduate student or not. But that's why I agree with you. And then you can go back and see what the authors arrived at the same conclusion as you did in your head. If not, why?
Yep.
These are all important things.
One of the things that always and continues to intimidate me, I try to learn about it every day, and I would consider myself average at best, the statistical portion of methods. My question to you is this. For me, if we're in the practical setting, right, maybe central tendency, mean median, dispersion of the data, standard deviation, perhaps standard error of measure, and then maybe Z scores. What do you feel from taking, again, not the lab setting, but a coaching, a pragmatic, maybe a director of sports performance? What do you feel that practitioners should know about statistical inference in terms and measures of, hey, what's good to know, what's need to know, what, hey, you can know at a later time?
In terms of the statistical side?
Yeah, and you might say nothing. I'm just curious your opinion on it from the practical side. So I'm not talking. I'll give you an example. For my PhD, I heavily relied on statisticians. Like that, I work with them, but that was their specialty. So I considered myself a neo-generalist as a statistician, for lack of a better word.
I think one concept that really, really stands out for me is to really kind of wrap your head around what a frequentist thinking style is, and what a p-value means, and to understand that, so to understand that concept, to understand the concept of sampling, and to understand the concept of effect size. And I'll often ask this question in just sort of rhetorically, because again, I've been asked this as well by mentors: is how many moms and babies do you need to have to show statistically that moms are taller than the babies? And again, the variance is very, very low. The mean difference is massively high. And within about, if you had a random, if you had a population of moms and babies and you randomly sampled about 6 of them, you're at a place now where your confidence, like you're better than chance that there's something real there, right? Because the variance is so small and the effect is so big. On the other hand, you can imagine scenarios, Anthony, like trying to predict injuries, trying to predict, like, does bacon cause cancer? And now you're getting into this world where the effects are quite small, right? So by definition, the effects are small from a frequentist mindset. You're going to need to have more people, right, to be able to show this effect. And obviously, there's a chance when you're undersampled that you find a one-off, there's a statistical difference here, but really it's just like kind of sheer luck that happened, or you're missing statistical power. So you say there's no difference and you got a p-value of 0.075, and you say, we couldn't conclude that there was a statistical difference here. But if you'd only sampled, include 50 more people, you would have nudged under that 0.075 to a 0.04, and everything's different. I think that's another thing that for practitioners, we have to kind of wrap our head around, is that those concepts are deeply rooted in statistics, and they're deeply rooted into how we think about probability, and how we think about sort of sampling, and how we think about experimental design and interpretation of data. And I would argue that as practitioners, we're more interested in the moms and babies stuff than in the bacon and cancer stuff. Like, I want to know what the big rocks are from a training perspective. Like, what are the things that really put a dent in the things that matter, for the context and the situation at hand. And I guess with that said, is I think having ways to understand, the error in your measurements, to understand that signal to noise ratio in these measures, to be able to have ways to think about the problem. And then the last piece I'll say here that I believe is really crucial for our world is it naturally lends itself, when you're in the world of sport, that you will be able to monitor athletes over time. So you have the same people for many years potentially over time, on whom you will collect repeated data, repeated measurements. And you will be able to eventually gather reasonable sized data sets for inquiring and looking at what relationships in the data. And I think that the final point I would say here for people that are diving down this path is to it's like it'd be like you want to learn some self-defense, and do you learn from white belt, basic block, clock, shoulder roll, break fall, or do you go on a weekend crash course and you have somebody say, "Okay, here's your move. You're gonna throw the jab. You're gonna come here and you're gonna do this, and we're gonna work on this move that gives you a response should you be attacked." So it's much more practical. Like, you're not going to know everything. You're not going to know the whole body of the martial art, but you have some tools in your toolbox that you can use to address scenarios that might come your way. And I think in a similar way for us sports science people, it's always good to have a statistician in your back corner. And I think it's good to have a handful of statistical methods that you can rely on to be able to use that fit our world of what happens with data collection. And that's been sort of my strategy is to, I realize there's lots I could learn and there's lots of ways to skin the cat, so to speak. But I would like to be comfortable and really understand some robust methods that really work for the types of study that I do. And I think that's another piece of advice maybe for people who are listening who are in that space is to, don't get overwhelmed. Try to get the basics, but then, start to understand what are some different tools that fit your scenario.
I like this idea of effect size, the big difference between the groups being measured. And I think it's also, too, something I've continued to learn about with p-values. I mean, is it statistically significant or clinically significant? And there's ways to make those numbers and those p-values move south, larger sample sizes. I mean, there's so many different ways. I always try to look at the effect size, and I don't take the p-value with a grain of salt, but I want to do my due diligence before kind of digging a little deeper with that as well, if that makes any sense.
It does for sure. And it has to happen because there is one game that we're playing when you're doing science, and that is that science inherently is biased to the null result. So
yeah,
like if you do a study and you get out and we can find anything, there's a good chance that maybe your paper will be rejected on the basis that didn't show anything. And that's a real problem. And it's a real problem with the p-value, right? Because we all know how that works. It works. It's the probability of observing that result or a more extreme result, given that the null hypothesis is true, right? That there's no difference. And so, but what does that mean? Like, I mean, what I really care about is I care about, what are each of the individuals doing? How are they responding? What might be sort of a way to look at the effects of whatever it is we're talking about here?
Yep.
And honestly, presenting the data in such a way that if it's an important question, so like a thesis-driven study that has an important question, show the data and let the reader really figure it out for themselves and help provide some context. Whether or not your p-value tipped under 0.05 or not, like let's talk about it in terms of what it could mean and show the data and let people mull it over. I think that's an important component of this and often overlooked. And it's too bad because we end up in a world where you do these studies and you do everything you can to find a statistically significant result so you can hopefully get a better chance of publishing.
Yes.
And then you're like, well, I didn't. And so then you feel like you failed, But there could be so many great things that are in those data that are being sort of like disregarded or might help advance things, right? So
yes. I think there needs to be a separate journal for that. We could learn just as much probably. What I mean?
And I think that's the challenge thing about elite sport. Like we don't have, and I found this with ski racing. Like that's where my PhD work was done. And, if you can Google this. If you go to the FIS website, in any given World Cup speed event, there might be 50 people who compete.
Yeah.
So maybe 100. Let's just say 100 for lack of a better, just keep the numbers simple. 100. There's 100 elite ski racers that can do that on the planet. The rest can't.
Yep.
And I'm going to do a study with 10 people. I've captured 10% of the elite ski racing population. And could you imagine if you captured 10% of the population in a study? Like, that would be considered probably a pretty robust thing, right? And
absolutely.
And so people would throw back to me and say, wow, you've got 11 people in each group, the sample size. I'd say, well, yeah, you're correct. And then, Walter would remind me it's moms and babies, right? So don't you care about the effects? The bigger the effects, the more, the less concerned we are about, yeah, absolutely. And then we would just say, yeah, it is a limitation, but by definition, these are elite. And they are, by definition, the outliers, and there's just not a lot of them. So,
such a good point. Such a good point.
And that's just the reality, right? So
another off the cuff question, because I want to get to your research. I'm geeky. I want to ask all these questions because I'm learning. Frequentist approach. Are you more inclined now to use more priors like Bayesian inference, or are you still sticking with frequentist specifically with all the longitudinal research that you've collected? Have you found any ways to use that in your research?
Yeah, I don't know enough about, beyond the theory and understanding generally what is happening. This is where a limitation of my knowledge comes up. And I have the honor, the privilege of sitting in at this company called Plantiga. It's a wearable, it's a company in Vancouver. They make an insole. They use an IMU, and then they use machine learning, predicts your, ground contact time, your stride length, your limb speed, your foot speed. Like, it's really pretty cool. And as the company has progressed, I love listening to the computer science engineering team and their development of models.
Yep.
And what they do, Anthony, which I freaking like, oh my God, that's how you guys do this, is they say, we're doing what we call a horse race. I was like, what's a horse race? Well, we're going to take these data, and we are going to do everything from simple linear regression models to, maybe generalized additive modeling, so a little bit more complex, to looking at Bayesian methods, to looking at machine learning. Yeah. And we're going to race all the models against each other to see which one does best with the data that we have.
Wow, I like that idea.
And then they optimize in the background that they might have 4 or 5 models running at any one point in time.
Very interesting.
And they make it really clear to me, like, one guy, his name's Kurt, but he's, PhD in, astrophysics and something. He's very great. I love to sit back and watch him do data science because it's just amazing to watch. And I feel like I'm observing, George St. Pierre fighting in the octagon. Like, I'm watching a true artist, you know, and watching how he thinks about the problems and what he's doing and how he's pulling all things together. And, it's just amazing that he's like, the difference between what we're doing here and what you do in peer-reviewed science is, in peer-reviewed science, it doesn't necessarily have to make a difference. So, you publish a paper and you use an ANOVA or a linear mixed effects model or a whatever. And, that's what we chose. Okay, great. Did you see it? Did you find it? We found a statistical difference here. Great. What are you going to do with that data? Well, there's a difference. Awesome. Like, so now what? Well, nothing. Like, nothing. There's no next step, right? Whereas in their world, they're trying to make N=1 predictions. So they're trying to understand, based on people who are using the system, when is something different?
Yeah.
And when do we need to put the check engine light on in the car to notify the person and their movement coach that something has changed and that now maybe an action should be taken? And to me, it's brilliant. I was like, of course, that's what you guys do. Is you don't hang your hat on a single model. You race 5 models against each other and you see which one does a better job. And you make a horse race. And I think back to my my graduate studies, my master's program. I ran into this like major issue at my defense. I had done a crossover design for my master's study. I was at the time ill-equipped to figure out how to do the repeated measures ANOVA that would allow me to do this. I found this textbook that was written by an expert in statistics, and they showed this really simple way of analyzing crossover design data based on the mean difference between the groups. So group 1 gets, time point 1 minus time point 2. Group 2 gets time point 1 minus time point 2. But the order is different, right? So treatment minus control and control minus treatment. Okay. And essentially, you take the mean difference between groups and you use the pooled standard deviation. Okay. And you can create an analysis for a crossover design. But honestly, it was simple. I could understand it. I could articulate it. I couldn't have defended the ANOVA. I had an examiner who was coming in who felt that that method was completely wrong and that, it should have been something else that I should have done. And I can recall in this moment of sincere, like total angst and panic and stress where I was like, oh my God, I'm going to blow this defense and I don't know what I'm doing. And you're doubting everything you've ever learned. I went and consulted with a biostatistician and they said, Matt, the most important thing is your data is robust. So no matter how you look at it, it should point towards the same conclusion. If you have to look at it only one way to make this work, and that one way, he's like, you're missing the fact that your data might be not robust against how you look at it. Okay. And so kind of comes back to the full circle here, Anthony, which is that I think when it comes to these methods, when you're a sports science person and you understand that that's how biostatisticians and computer scientists, that they're doing this, and in the background, it just goes to show you, like, Bayesian methods. Yeah, sure. I would love, but what I would love to do is have a computer scientist that could help me compete my data to be able to make better predictions about the things I care about.
Yep.
And so I don't use the Bayesian methods. I went on a rant there, but no. I think that that's a really important thing. It's like, I'd hate to say, oh, it's this or that. It's To me, it's pragmatic. Like, what's your end goal and how are you going to use the data? That's what I want to use. I want to create data that I can use to do something down the road.
I love it. And very, very in-depth response. Unbelievable conversation. Listen, I've got so many more questions and we're already 45 minutes in. So this is unbelievable. I wanted to hit on something that I learned. Many things. Assessment of mechanical muscle function in athletes. This is your force plate course I took probably 3-4 years ago. Unbelievable resource. And I'll make sure that you get a chance we'll put that in the show notes, your courses that are offered. It was unbelievable. One of the things that I loved, I believe it was created by Dr. Dave Clark. He called this creating a hierarchy of evidence. Could you expand on that for us? Like the difference, again, like what is the most important? I know you've talked about it, but it's your sample size as an athlete or as a coach. Can you talk about like layering that evidence?
Yeah, I think it, simply put, and I just want to shout out to Dave that I think it was just a brilliant slide that I stole from a guy named Trent Stellingworth, by the way. Okay. So Trent had Dave's slide. Okay.
Okay. You stole, I got you.
I'm going to take it and put, make sure that credit is due. That was Dave's thinking, but I did steal that slide from Trent conceptually. So both those guys probably deserve some credit, but Dave certainly deserves credit. And I'm sure Trent had influence there too. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So thank you to both of them. But it's just saying, like, moving from sheer, anecdote, 60% of the time, this works every time, right? Like the old quote from Will Ferrell, right? In Anchorman, it's like, you drink your own Kool-Aid. Yep. I'll tell you, every time I've done this method, it works every time. How do you know that? I just know it. What about the times where you use that method and that it didn't work? Well, it never didn't work. What do you talk? Like we drink our own Kool-Aid and we believe in our anecdotes and we believe in our crap. You go up one more layer, maybe it's talking to an expert, who uses these methods, and you go up another layer, and now you're collecting some data and some information, but it's not systematic, and you're just sort of, at least you're measuring something, and then you come up another level. And as we ascend these ranks of evidence, a lot of times what people will say is the highest evidence is peer-reviewed science. And we all know what the limitation there is, that, we've already said the aforementioned issues with elite athletes is they're by definition the outliers, and most studies don't make it in there. And let's face it, most people doing the work at the coalface, they're not publishing, right? So what I love about Dave's hierarchy of evidence is he's got peer-reviewed science as the second bar, and then the top bar is the data that you collect over time on a single athlete.
That is brilliant.
It's brilliant.
And it's interesting. That slide has had a profound impact on the way I think. It's interesting too now to, current moment, fast forward. I'm in one of the Altus mentorship groups, and Dan Pfaff, Coach Pfaff, I know he's been a mentor of both of ours, but he constantly talks about this idea of the most important thing you can do is have longitudinal data over time. That's the most important thing that you can rely on as a sports scientist or as a sport. So it's just interesting. But I wanted to pivot if I could. This is a massive passion of yours. I want to get into your research as well, but return to play from lower body injury. Testing. I know there's a plethora of tests that are available to performance coaches. I'm biased a little bit, and I would love you to disagree with me or disagree. But testing for me now is taken on a whole different understanding. For me, for the sport of hockey, I want it to be able to give good narrative to a coach, minimal physiological interference. So if they're in training camp, I don't want someone getting crushed. And then I want to be able to use that test for baseline, baseline numbers. What are your thoughts on choosing good tests? Are there any that you prefer? I know counter movement jump, obviously, on the force plate, but are there any other tests that you feel would be good baselines? And do you agree with that in terms and measures of choosing an actual test in the performance setting?
I think there are plenty of good tests out there that I think are relevant for the environment that we're in, but certainly within the framework of whatever is mattering for your context, I think that there probably are better tests than others. I've spent a lot of time with the jumping athlete and a double force plate system to look at the kinetics of the jumping athlete, which I think is, simply put, most of the time I don't care how high people jump. For a lot of sports I work with, it's not really a performance determinant. They're not jumpers. They're doing other things. But what I like about jumping is that it's standardized, it's repeatable, and it allows me to measure important neuromuscular capacities. For example, plyometric capacity, aka stretch shorten cycle capacity, eccentric deceleration capacity, propulsive capacity. Like, these are things that have relevance sort of just generally to many of the sports. And what I like about the jumping athlete on a force plate is it's pretty good. It's pretty easy to figure out how noisy these variables are, and you can fit them into several different contexts. The other one that I think that I'm still pushing hard on, and I don't know that I've seen anything that sort of cracked the nut of this, but the measures of isometric strength capacity, so looking at force time or torque time curves, and specifically at maximal torque or force, like your strength, but then really breaking down explosive strength or the rate of force development, which I still think that we're kind of hampered by. And sometimes it's a bit more noisy. We look at it in ways that maybe is just not quite as robust. But I do think that in my mental map of this, I think there are very likely things that we could draw from looking at explosive strength measures that could inform us about other neuromuscular underpinnings comparatively to just strength. So I will say that I think that's another space that I still believe strongly today that I think is worth exploring and worth developing. Of course, I totally remain open to being completely proven wrong and eating my words in 5 years. And it's not. But today, my belief is that this is worth pursuing and heading down the road on. And then beyond that, I mean, I think it comes down to the environment that you're in, and there are plenty of good ways to break down both of those tests from multi-joint, single joint, whether you want to do a counter movement jump, a drop jump, a single leg counter movement jump. But all those things I think would be sort of like umbrella options that sort of feed off of that. Yeah. I mean, those are a couple that come to mind.
When it comes to isometric test, are you more in favor of the isometric mid thigh pull? Would that be the full body measure of choice?
No, it's not for me. And there's a couple of reasons why that is. And this is where, this isn't necessarily a scientific answer, because I think if you look at the data on mid thigh pulling, I think it's probably a reasonable test. I mean, it seems reasonably repeatable. I think that, there's been some correlation studies looking at how it relates to various dynamic measures of competitive skills and whatnot. I mean, I know that it's sort of become accepted. So I think that, science would probably support, this being something that if you were interested in using, you should probably feel okay about that step. Yep. My problem with it has always been that in my environment, one of the things that I'm really interested in doing is really understanding how the neuromuscular systems of athletes change and adapt from a very relatively young age. So athletes who might be 15 or 16, 17 or 18, and then watching them across their career span till maybe they're 35, 36, 38.
Yep.
And to being able to have these ways that I can compare that 15-year-old to that 36-year-old, both within the person over time, but between people. And one of the challenges that I have is that I found that in that paradigm, too often the mid-thigh pull is a test that, for whatever reason, not athletes can perform at the same level. So, for instance, maybe their grip strength isn't great, or maybe they're a bit dysgenic and they don't like to be in that isometric pulling posture. Or, for instance, that it really tests your strength in an extended knee joint position, which is great. But a lot of the athletes that I work with, like they are typically stronger in a lower position. We often see this with ski racers and speed skaters, that their postures that they use are much more compressed. Like they're in these sort of static, like 90-degree angle hockey postures. I mean, for people who watch hockey, but even lower, right? So there's a limitation there for me. And so what I found is that, and if you get a 15-year-old in there, chances are it's going to take some time for them to learn how to do the test.
Yep.
It may not even be that summer that they're actually competent in it. Many athletes that I would train in those sports as well, like these sort of different winter sports, honestly, Olympic lifting would be and it depends. It's like, well, I mean, this speed skater, should they do Olympic lifting? Well, do they like it? Are they willing to learn it? Are they willing to invest the time in it?
Yep.
Are they good at those bilateral Olympic lift, deadlift, squatting? Or, as very often is the case, they just have no interest in it. And so I end up, gravitating much more towards split stance, single leg variants, and that becomes the meat and potatoes of the program, is to do a lot of single leg training, a lot of single leg work. And so I would have this discrepancy now where you want to track strength over time, you're using a mid-thigh pull. And for all these reasons, it may or may not be a relevant test for the groups I was working with. And what I found to be a much more effective test, and it was relatively cheap, was to build a leg press off of a hammer leg press machine and to mount a Pasco force plate and to sit the person in the rig. And this rig that we have right now is definitely not the most comfortable. It needs to be improved greatly in terms of its ergonomics, but you can get a measure of strength independent of technical capacity of the lift, set the angles, independent of whether you Olympic lift or you don't, you have grip strength or you don't, your back hurts or it doesn't, you're 15 and you don't know what to do, or you 35 and you don't want to do it anymore. You got a test where you can put somebody in there, push as hard as you can against this plate. And it's a good global measure of strength. And so because my research is very much about the longitudinal analysis, I need tests that are a little bit more simple and not as maybe prone to participant attrition. And so full circle is to say that I have no problem with mid-thigh pull test, but I prefer a single leg press isometric test just because it's a bit more conducive in the world that I work in.
Very interesting. I want to kind of unload a little bit on the force plate assessment, specifically the metrics that you look at? I know it can be specifically nowadays, at least with the commercialization, a lot of either professional National Hockey League teams, college hockey teams, even private gyms such as myself are outfitted with force plates. So as you can appreciate, there's a lot of variables to look at, a lot of moving parts. Based on your experience, are there 2 or 3 metrics? And I know it's probably dependent on sport, biomechanics, and perhaps I know with you working so close with ski racers, maybe it's ski racers, or maybe it's just an aggregate of what do you look for from a braking standpoint, propulsive standpoint? Is there force at minimal displacement? What are 1 or 2 variables that you think are really important to look at over the long run?
So, I'll just maybe point the listenership here of your podcast towards a paper that Chris Bishop was the first author. And there's a whole bunch of us that were, and thanks to Chris for allowing me to be a part of it. But it's in the Strength and Conditioning Journal, NSCA's Practical Journal, and it's like a framework for selection of jump metrics when using force plates. And I think it's a really good starting place to go for anybody out there who is interested in that, in an answer to that question. And what I like about the paper is we really narrowed it down to 5 things.
Great.
And specifically, so I always come back to this, Anthony. It's like, well, what's the mechanical variable that determines the motion when I jump? And the answer to that question is it's the impulse, through the impulse momentum relationship. And that's, Newton's laws of motion, which, back to our discussion on scientific theories, despite the fact that Newton's laws of motions don't really work very well for super small things where we've got quantum mechanics, and things that are moving near the speed of light where we've got theory of relativity, Newtonian mechanics is a robust theory of how things work on the Earth.
Yep.
And the jumping athlete, all things being equal, where they're trying to jump straight up and down, it is going to be the vertical impulse that determines what happens.
Sure.
Your downward velocity of your body center of mass is affected by how you unload, how far you drop down. So we said in the paper that you want to probably look at your counter movement depth. You displace down 10 centimeters or 20 centimeters as a starting point. Your minimum downward velocity, what determines what brings your moment, like your velocity of your body center of mass to 0 before you start to come back up, is your net eccentric acceleration impulse. So mechanically, it's not your peak force. It's not your force at 0 velocity. It's not your rate of force development. It's your net eccentric impulse that determines how your capacity to bring your downward velocity and make it 0 so you can start to come back up. So I think that the net eccentric deceleration impulse, it also happens to be a relatively stable measure. Certainly, while there be a correlation between your net eccentric deceleration impulse and your rate of force development, it's just a little bit less noisy, and rate of force development tends to be a little bit more noisy. It doesn't mean that you should or shouldn't use it, but that's just my feeling, because we're trying to narrow this down to a handful. So you have your net eccentric deceleration impulse, and then you've got your propulsive impulse, which is determining your takeoff velocity. And what we found based on our analysis of jumping athletes with force plates is that if you determine the takeoff velocity, and you can easily take that and turn it into a jump height, takeoff velocity squared times divided by 2 times gravity gives you how high you jump. But your takeoff velocity is one of the most stable measures that you can extract from a jumping athlete based on our analysis. A coefficient of variation of about 1.9%, sort of between tests. And at the end of the day, it's a really good indicator of how well did you jump. So whether you take that takeoff velocity and turn it into a jump height is up to you, but that impulse momentum relationship of looking at jump performance with that measure is probably your other marker. And so unload. So how far you go down, how do you put the brakes on, net eccentric deceleration impulse, which is going to determine how I bring my center of mass to 0, and propulsion. And those are 3 metrics that sort of are anchor points for me. And then after that point, it's now getting a little more nuanced, where we're starting to look at the kinetics, and we're starting to break down the kinetics in various ways to maybe extract measures that might be less well understood, but nevertheless could be valuable. Mm-hmm. And I'll just give you an example, because I just would like to say that for your listeners, there's a great starting point. Super simple, 3 things. And if you go to Chris's paper, the one thing that we add in as well is RSI mod and your jump contraction time. And because now with your jump contraction time, you can look at how fast did they jump. So I would just add those 2 in just to be safe about those 5 metrics. But now I think it really depends. And I'll give you an example. Like we just published a paper where I got this from Per Agard, who's also a big part of my PhD. And, my initial papers that I was looking at with, trying to break down the jumping human with a force plate for purposes of ACL return to sport type stuff, I looked at a lot of Per's work that was done in an aging population. And one metric that they reported on when they were looking at differences between elderly males and females was how much your velocity drops off from your maximum velocity of your body center of mass to the point of takeoff. So we called it the Vmax TOV ratio.
Okay.
So basically, do I drop off 10%, whatever, 5%, what have you? And we just recently looked at that in ACLR athletes, and we found that what was really interesting is that in ACLR athletes, the bigger the difference between their drop off in Vmax and TOV, like it's almost a 2-fold greater impact on their jump height. So with a non-injured athlete, for every 0.1 meter per second that your body center of mass drops off from your Vmax to your takeoff, you lose about 5 centimeters in jump height. But then for an ACLR athlete, for every 1.1 meters per second that they drop off, they're losing about 10 centimeters in jump height based on the analysis that we conducted. And so there's an example where, when you break down a jump, and I always say, obviously a jump is fundamentally how high did you jump? But now you want to break it down and say, I'd like to look at the jump strategy and things that got you to that jump height. Yes. There's an example of like a type of metric that I think you could go into and you could say, this is actually answering a very specific question that we have around ACL injured athletes, because we want to know how do we not only restore vertical jump capacity, but also how do you find deficits in the ACL injured athlete that could be trainable if you knew they were there? And they might be important markers of readiness, right? And so I don't have answers to those last 2 questions, but simply looking at jump height alone might not be enough. But there's an example of where you can break it down. So force at zero velocity or all these other, impulse or rate of force development around that point. There's a multitude of measures that I think you can extract. And I think, I always say it's like you have your go-to metrics, which are the first aforementioned 5, which I think are safe bet. And then you have another layer where I do believe it's a safe bet, but, I would just say, just know what you're measuring, why you're measuring, and see if you can relate it back to something mechanical. What I don't like, Anthony, from a thinking standpoint, and this is where I'll stop with this because I know time is of the essence here, but it's like there's no my experience as strength coaches, there's no shortage of ratios and PET numbers and things that people look at.
Yes,
I like to look at the blah 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 blah. Why is that? Well, we did this stuff and take it out. I've always anchored my thinking in saying, okay, fundamental, what's it telling me about the physiology? What's it telling me about the biomechanics? What's it telling me about, based on good mechanics, what's this telling me about how they jump? And if I can't answer that question, whatever said metric is, like, I look at the force at the 75th percentile of, like the whatever. You just need to keep yourself honest and say, okay, so what does that mean? And if you can answer that, that's great. But I believe that that's a good thing to do at that next layer, is to start to think, okay, what's it telling me about the physiology? What's it telling me about the biomechanics? How might this relate to things that you need to figure out or find in this unique population? And sure, there's a multitude of metrics at that level, I think that we can examine.
I will make sure to attach that paper to the show notes. I have, for our listeners, that sounds fantastic. That's an unbelievable in-depth menu analysis from what to look for and why it's important. So thanks for sharing your wisdom. Let me ask you this question. First of all, I want to respect your time. I know we're already 6 minutes over. Do you have a few extra minutes to discuss some of your research, or are you sure?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, and perhaps it'll weave into this next pivot here. I know it's a 2014. I know in science that's eons ago. I know that your opinion might have changed 1,000 times, but I wanted to return to skiing envelope of function for ACL, anterior ligament reconstruction, elite alpine ski racers. The onset into my PhD and reading this was an unbelievable article at the time. I still think it is. Could you give us kind of a brief synopsis, if you could, a footnote version of what you were looking for? And specifically, could you talk about this asymmetry index?
Yeah, so the idea of an envelope of function is from paper, 1996 paper. The first author's last name is Dye.
Okay.
And it's sort of it's conceptual. I believe he was a surgeon, orthopedic surgeon, who would, put this paper out and said, hey, let's think about return to sport as an envelope of function. And so this idea that, for your sport and your position and how you play the game, there would exist conceptually an envelope of function that you need to get back to sport and competition and performance.
Okay.
And we know this takes time. And we know that it probably needs to be seen through a sport-specific, age-specific, sex-specific, position-specific lens on some level. And then what you really care about as a coach or a physical therapist is if you knew it was there, you could prescribe the right training that would bridge the gap and would allow this person to kind of bridge where they are today to where they need to be, is you could build this envelope of function in this concept of rebuilding the capacities that the athlete needed. And so in the paper, what we were addressing was, number one, how would we think about this concept of an envelope of function? And how would you think about this conceptually to say, I need to build this in such a way that as I'm monitoring this athlete who's coming back from injury, back to sport, back to competition, back to performance, knowing that on average that re-injury may be happening 2 years after their initial injury, knowing that in a great high fraction of the time, it's a contralateral knee injury that's occurring. So you re-injure the other knee. And knowing that, probably a little over half of athletes make it back to their pre-injury performance level. They don't really ever kind of bridge the gap. And I would just say, as a performance coach, I believe that exercise is my medicine, training's my medicine, right? That's my pen to paper. I give you training, you go train, we move the needle. I believe I can measure these things. And I believe that by measuring these things and by monitoring these things, I can figure out what matters, measure what matters, and change what matters. And that's my value proposition in this whole journey across this envelope of function. And really at the end of the day, Anthony, stumbling on this asymmetry index, I mean, it was a simple by chance thing how I started using it practitioner wise. But really what I'm measuring is the fraction. So you have your vertical ground reaction force. It's the fraction that the left and right are contributing to that.
Yep.
And what I'm trying to determine is, do you have two symmetrically strong limbs? And that's the goal after an injury. Two symmetrically strong limbs. And, shout out to Sophia Nynthias. Just because you have it doesn't mean you use it.
Yep.
But if you don't have it, you can't use it. So just because you're strong doesn't mean you use it when you play. We know there's another layer there to express, to being able to have your strength appear in your movement strategies and how you're doing your sport. But if you're not strong, if you have a weakened limb or two weakened limbs, there's no way you're going to use it.
Yeah.
So because you don't have it, right?
Yep.
So that's the simple thing. Yep. And really, at the end of the day, the asymmetry index was just a way to compare one limb to the other in the jumping athlete using this impulse asymmetry index, where we compare the impulse in the braking phase and the propulsive phase, right to left. We also look at the absolute impulse. So really, at the end of the day, how do you perform absolute wise in the counter movement jump? And then what's the fraction of the left and the right? And we're using that to say, can we get you within 5%? And can we make sure that you've restored your stretch, shortened cycle capacity to a sufficient level? And that was the 2014 paper, was to tee all that up in concept, because Anthony, before that paper, we rolled the dice. We were the classic, time dependent. When were you ready to get back? Well, whenever the surgeon said you're ready.
Yeah.
If the surgeon says 9 months, it was okay, we're doing 9 months. And what happens? Well, we high five you and away you go, you get back on snow, and that's it. We never talk about it again. So we were missing tests that could really allow us to assess the neuromuscular capacities of the ACL injured athlete. And we were missing this idea that it's not passing the final exam at 9 months and getting I'm back. I go, guys. I've got the green light. We got to monitor this athlete for probably the rest of their career. And we need to have a lens of 2-3 years minimum of looking at how they're progressing towards or regressing away from their benchmarks.
It's a brilliant metric. I think it's absolutely, in my opinion, specifically with regarding return to play. I mean, what a great baseline to have should something go south during the season.
Totally, yeah,
it's
exactly. It's just the way that
it's unbelievable. Let me ask you this question, and it might say it depends. Maybe I'll offer context, but looking at the research right now, this magic 15% number, less than 15% left to right, has that number changed? Is it now 5%? Is it now 10%? Where is it at right now to this current day in terms and measures of left to right differences in performance?
There is no rhyme or reason based on what I've read as to why this is.
Okay.
And so what we've aimed to do is we've aimed to look at large numbers of non-injured athletes that fit the profile. So you're a strong, good performing athlete that fits the benchmark of what a good athlete in your sport looks like.
Yes.
We characterize their interlimb asymmetries, and we find that on average, they're kind of plus or minus 5%, and we know what their capacities are. We know how high they jump, how much braking impulse they generate. And what we do is we create benchmarks that are a little more stringent than saying 15. We map out and say, well, a non-injured athlete looks like this.
Yes.
So that's going to be our goal. And to that point, Anthony, like many of our athletes are achieving a 15% benchmark at around, I don't know, like 8-9 months.
Yep.
But what we'll see is that it takes more than 2.5 years for them to restore their asymmetries to the levels of non-injured controls. And it takes more than 5 years for them to restore their stretch shortened cycle capacity to the level of elite performers. So, again, great. At 9 months, you're 15%. That sort of feels like a high five moment, especially knowing that, at 9 months, your highest risk for injury is 24 months. So I'm more interested in tracking this athlete over time. And I think that that's why, maybe in how we think about return to play and return to sport testing, it's got to be, to me, we've got to number one, say what is our benchmarks and how are we going to use some evidence to establish this, the best evidence we can.
Yep.
And maybe that's a pre-injury status or a really good athlete who's got a good status to compare to. And if not, we got to use comparative controls that are good athletes that are like, hey, here's the bench. This is what we're saying is recovered. And then we need to have a lens that it's, this idea of 15%. Like, why would it be 15% when the best athletes in that sport who are non-injured have an asymmetry of 5% and have like 1.5 times the performance?
Yeah.
It's like you're again, like, let's just say, I know people don't like some people don't like mechanical power and jumping, but whatever, I tend to look at it sometimes. So we look at the external peak mechanical power. So the power being done, sort of being exerted on the system, which we measure with force plates. And let's say that a really good elite athlete generates 65 watts per kilo and has a 5% asymmetry. Why would I be comfortable with an athlete coming back to sport and saying they're good with 15% asymmetry and 50 watts per kilo?
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't make any sense to me. So what we've tried to do is to look at that, really challenge those notions to say, we don't really know for sure what this is. Interestingly, Andy King published a series of papers recently that are kind of interesting because what it showed was asymmetries had no bearing on future risk of re-injury. It was actually your absolute stretch shortened cycle performance in a drop jump that was a kind of a weak predictor, but statistically significant predictor of re-injury.
Okay.
But it wasn't asymmetry. Like the amount of asymmetry in the group that fared well with no re-injury was about the same as the injured group. So they were both about 15%, different side to side. It's just that the group that fared well was like just way stronger overall. So they had two strong but asymmetrically strong limbs. As opposed to two strong or two weak symmetric or two weak asymmetric limbs. So
very interesting.
I think the asymmetry index it's a great way to contextualize things. People get it. 10%, 15%, 5%, no problem. I understand what that means. But as practitioners, we need to say, hey, listen, yeah, that's part of it, but we're setting a benchmark criteria that's a bit more of a long-term horizon. And it's based on non-injured athletes that are a good representative example of what you should be. And we're not just looking at how asymmetrical you are, but we're also looking at just like how strong are both limbs independent of that asymmetry.
Brilliant. And once again, the need for, and the beautiful data set that you have of longitudinal data to be able to measure what is healthy, what is high performing, and then what happens after an injury. That's huge. I'll ask one last question. New research. Can you give us a brief synopsis? 2022 forecasting neuromuscular recovery after ACL ligament injury. Can you give me a 30-second Reader's Digest version if you could, Matt?
Yeah, sure. I mean, honestly, Anthony, I don't know how this will land, and I will, as I always say, if 5 years down the road, I reserve the right to be dead wrong on everything that was done today. But I believe that what those two papers are trying to do from my perspective is trying to highlight to those individuals like yourselves who may be deploying this more serial neuromuscular testing in your real world environment. And you're collecting data and you're doing this on a weekly or monthly basis and your data sets are growing. It's meant to show how you could use those data to answer some fundamental questions that I think we're all asking. And to be honest with you, I'm not asking the question at 9 months, what's going to predict whether you get re-injured again? I'm trying to answer a question in very practical terms about how is this athlete looking compared to other athletes that were like them? And do we agree that this athlete is ready to make a transition back to a higher risk environment? And what I'm also interested in is after they begin this transition, are they progressing or regressing away from what we would call recovery?
Okay. I'm
also interested in knowing, when athletes have severe injuries, traumatic knee injuries, and we're sitting here at the outset and we're all, so when do we think they're going to come back? If that's the first question out of management's mouth or coach's mouth, or it's what can we expect, doc? And the doc will say, well, I don't know, maybe 11 months or 12 months, but this is meant to be able to kind of take a data-driven approach to that.
Okay.
And so what we're trying to do is use the data to model recovery, model changes, using what we call additive mixed effects modeling, which is sort of like in between a linear model, which is straight lines,
yep,
and machine learning, which is kind of a black box. Additive mixed effects modeling allow you to account for the repeated measures over time,
okay,
and for the possibility that there are nonlinear changes in the data. So you can fit what's called splines, and your data can have different shapes. And to this end, what we're trying to do is to create data-informed estimates of when somebody might be ready to return and how sort of forecasting, like you are 8 months post-surgery, but you look like you're 10.
Fantastic.
So that's the two papers. And we tried to highlight how you could use this, show athletes that were, recovering faster than predicted or faster than expected or behind schedule. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Comparing between graft types, like how does a bone patellar tendon bone change compared to a hamstring?
You are the man,
yeah,
and I can't thank you enough for your time. I've got so many more questions. We're going back for part 2. Fast and Frugal Trees return to play. Yeah. You are the man. Thanks for your passion. Thanks for all you do. Our guest today has been Dr. Matt Jordan. Matt, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Great to be here and just really enjoyed myself. So looking forward to that second one.
All right. Thank you.